Podcast, Season 2, Episode 2. Your weekly pep talk for living the writing life. I'm Elan.
I'm John.
I'm Craig.
And today we're going to be talking about a topic that is near and dear to many writers' hearts. We're calling it, It's All Been Done Before. Or has it? This idea came to me because I was working on my first ever epic fantasy project, and I was excitedly telling a friend of mine about it, and I gave away the ending, which I thought was really original. The character sacrificed themselves to save the world. And my friend just looked at me and said, "That's Jesus." And I was taken aback. It hadn't even occurred to me that I was rewriting that story. I was a bit flummoxed by that event, to be totally honest.
Well, I could throw something in there on that. You know what? Then in that case, forget about Game of Thrones. It's not original either. It's just the War of the Roses. I could apply that same thing to that. I mean, told in an epic fantasy world, but what is it that makes Game of Thrones unique? Why do people go for it? It's because there's the author's unique vision. So your story might be archetypally the Jesus story, but you are going to do something different and unique. And as far as I'm concerned, that's what makes a story unique, is your vision and what you do with it.
Yeah. And it referenced to both A Song of Ice and Fire and the story that I was working on. Something that occurred to me sometime later, and it's definitely pep talky, is that there are people who believe that every story has been told, in particular because of academic analysis of story, like Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, or you can see videos of Kurt Vonnegut describing story structure and drawing these clever graphs that show you that there's essentially a limited number of story archetypes that you can tell. And if that's true, you can get into this mindset of why should I even tell my own story? Because even if it's been told before, you haven't told it your way. And there's definite merit to you telling it your way. I mean, The Matrix ended up being kind of cheesy. I don't know if you guys saw the third Matrix film. Have you?
I've not seen it.
Okay, I've seen all three, yeah.
But you know what I mean? Like, at the end, that's a very Jesus moment.
Mm-hmm. Salute.
Neo sacrifices himself. I mean, the Wachowskis get even a little bit heavy-handed with their metaphor by shining a cross of light through his body. But the sequels to The Matrix and their quality notwithstanding, it turns out that story's okay to tell again and again because it's a compelling story. It's a compelling narrative. And there are things you can change within that archetype that will provide new insight into whatever you're trying to show in your story. It could be cool magic. It could be feelings. It could be both. It should be both.
Yeah, well, in the case of The Matrix, it might be at its core level the Jesus story, but it's also about fighting in a alternate reality, or a digital reality that is a sort of counterfeit of our experience. And you've got slow motion fight scenes and gun battles, and I don't remember that from the Jesus story.
True, Jesus never did sweet bullet time stuff,
yeah.
At least as it's written.
And that's what makes The Matrix awesome.
Yeah, totally. So actually, that brings up a good question, which is, does fiction need to have some message, some purpose? Do you have to be changing the world with your book, or can it just be fun to read? Because I think that's where some of the stigma against genre fiction comes from.
I kind of went in a different way in my mind with what you just said, because there are a few authors that I have literally stopped reading because after I read their novel, I found out, this is actually a teaching novel meant to teach me a point about their worldview that I disagree with. And it wasn't just entertainment. I read to be entertained. Like if I'm reading fiction, I'm reading to be entertained. I'm not reading to be converted to a certain worldview. For example, I used to read Frank Peretti, who is a Christian thriller author. His book Monster. It was a decent book. I read through it, and then there was this author interview in the back, and the entire point of the book, according to the author, was to disprove evolution. Which, first of all, religious arguments aside or scientific arguments aside, I did not read that book to be taught a lesson. And it really turned me off. Michael Crichton did the same thing with State of Fear. That book was intended to teach people that climate change is a hoax. Yeah, and then Orson Scott Card wrote, is it Lost Boy or Lost Boys? It's semi-autobiographical, and I believe the point of that was to, other than being semi-autobiographical, it was to teach a little bit about the Mormon faith and the Mormon church, which, again, turned me off because I read books to be entertained.
That's a really good point. I mean, I don't think any of us really like to be talked down to in that way. And, you know, this sort of like Aesop's Fables mentality of morality, maybe it does have a place, but to be subversive about it, it does feel a little bit oily. Like you're like, I don't know if I like that.
Yeah, I would have been okay with it. Like, I don't agree with all three of those points that were made. No offense to any listeners, but I would have been okay with that if I knew going in this is a point of the story. But to find out about that after I read the story feels a little bit like I was conned into the story, like conned into being taught something I didn't necessarily want to be taught.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I personally have struggled with this whole idea of feeling like there has to be a great purpose, or like I you know, this it's sort of like having a big burden when I come to the keyboard and write. Or in this case, I'm working on a rewrite of something right now, and you know, and at the end of the day, I have to think about who my audience is. What am I doing this for? Is this about changing the world and how everybody thinks about the world, or am I just trying to tell a story that will engage the people I'm telling it to? One thing that really kind of helped me kind of see past this whole idea that there has to be this grand purpose to everything you do. It was an interview with the author Robert Jordan, and he was talking about one of the readers to the Wheel of Time series who he met. I guess they had contacted him, wrote him a letter, and they were sick and they had terminal cancer, I think. And he went to visit them in the hospital, and they told him about how, well, they went through some of their really difficult treatments earlier on to try to stop the cancer. The thing that had brought them comfort was his books. They had read through all of his books, and it just helped them get through that time. And when he had said that just moved him. He sort of on the verge of tears in that interview when he was telling that story. And that really struck a chord for me, because it makes me realize that, we could obsess and, try to perfect what we're writing and never put it out because it's not going to change the world. And, if Robert Jordan had done that and didn't put his books out there, that person who, was going through that tough time wouldn't have had that book to comfort them in that way. So what is the reason we write? Why do we put it out there? It can change the world, but what does it mean to change the world?
This makes me, I feel like we are circumventing a sort of central point, which might come off as a little bit crass, but in my opinion, it's actually like a huge weight lifted off of my shoulders. But that is, we should stop taking ourselves so seriously.
Yes.
You know what I mean? We, especially as writers, I mean, I think a great way to do it is to look at satire. Like Reed McSweeney's is fantastic. Follow the Twitter account at Guy in Your MFA and look at how these excellent satirical writers present present this archetypical writer with a capital W. And like, it's okay to have fun and write things that you think are cool and have dragons that spit rainbow fire. Like, whatever you want to do. You don't have to change the world. All you have to do is make somebody have a feeling. It can be happy, sad, scared, aroused, whatever it is that you want. And if it's in the framework that's been told before, that's also fine, because we watch the same movies over and over again, right?
Yeah, and then to kind of pull us back to the original topic here, it's all been done before, or has it? On the topic of movies, like, I was thinking, what are the big blockbuster movies that come out every year? They're basically the same things that come out year after year after year. Like, I mean, there's a Marvel franchise, but if you look at any sort of major blockbuster film, it's basically the same story structure. Like, there's some obstacle to overcome, there's fight scenes, there's big stars in it, and it reaches this satisfying conclusion. Whereas if you have a movie that's a little bit more quirky, a little bit more original, doesn't really fall into that stereotype of what a blockbuster movie should be, then that movie doesn't really do well, usually. And so it's kind of the same with books. Readers more or less want to read the same story over and over again, just told slightly differently. There are, of course, exceptions to everything I've just said. But a book that's truly unique generally doesn't do that well. And so, like, I'm also thinking of romance author Nora Roberts, who's written over 200 novels now. Wow. I can guarantee you that they are pretty much all the same story structure. Different characters, different location, slightly different plot, probably about the same story over and over again, but people eat them up because we crave the familiar, I think.
And something I would throw out there too is, you know, if you're as a writer, I mean, I agree that we should just have fun. We should not take it so seriously and go in there and do the work and let the work come out. But if you are concerned about wanting to say something with your writing, it's about recognizing that that's a process. That's not necessarily something that's going to be bottled up in one book. It'll come out through the process of you coming back again and again and writing stories, having fun, and discovering what you love about it. And that is going to come out through your voice, through your stories you tell, whether it's comedy, whether it's heavy-duty serious stuff, whether it's dark things, whether it's action. You are saying something to the world, and your readers are listening to your stories. And as long as you tell the story true and you really get to the why of why you're writing it, that's really all that's going to matter. You know, make sure the story is complete, and you didn't just rush it off. But you know, you don't want to spend your life perfecting something, because in a sense you'll just kill it if you do that.
Yeah, so we're at right about halfway, so I'm going to interrupt us for our reading recommendation, and this time I have the book for you guys to read. It is called Storyteller. Its subtitle is something along the lines of 27 Years of Experience with the Clarion Writers Workshop. It is by author Kate Wilhelm, who was one of the first instructors for Clarion. And if you don't know what Clarion is, it's a 6-week short story, science fiction, and fantasy writing intensive class that consistently churns out successful writers. And the book is fantastic. She tells stories about the experience of teaching at Clarion in the late 50s through the 60s. Like, this thing has been going for a very long time. But she also peppers the book with great tips on writing. And a central theme of hers at one point actually really inspired me, which it was basically so what if it's already been told?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's just a really great outlook. It's called Storyteller. It's by Kate Wilhelm, and I will include a link to it in the liner notes. So we're going to jump back into this notion of originality, I suppose, which is really at the core of this. What is it, like, should we throw away a book because it isn't original? Is it not worthwhile because it's not going to be a blockbuster? What do you guys think?
My choice to continue reading a book or to stop reading it is based entirely on, am I enjoying this book? I've had this really weird coincidence that has happened 2 or 3 times now, where I'm reading books from completely different genres, and they have the exact same plot point. And like, I read them at the exact same time. It was really strange. I read a James Rollins thriller. I can't remember the name of it right now. And I read one of the Alex Rider novels by Anthony Horowitz, which is a young adult novel series, like for the ages 8 to 12 age range. I was reading both of them at the same time. They had the exact same plot point, in that an evil genius wants to, I think, poison the world by using genetically modified crops that have some sort of retrovirus put in them. And then both books had to do with the seed vault that is in, like, the northern European countries that store seeds in the case of global, like, disasters, so that we have these seeds to renew our food source. And so, like, both books, exact same plot point. I read them at the exact same time, but I kept reading both of them because they were both told so well, and they both took the plot point in slightly different directions.
Yeah, my experience, like, there's something that I could, like, the last 2 fiction books I read, one was Leviathan Wakes, and the other one was American Gods. Actually, I didn't finish American Gods by Neil Gaiman, for those who aren't familiar with it. And Leviathan Wakes is by S.A. Corey.
James S.A. Corey.
James S.A. Corey. Oh, I'm glad you're here.
He borrowed the book.
It's actually now a show on Sci-Fi called The Expanse, for those of you who are big fans.
Season, it was just great. And I think the next season's coming out in a month or 2. So, yeah. So, what I noticed about that, I mean, I read much slower. I've recently sort of rebooted my reading routine. But what I noticed is Leviathan Wakes, there was a sense every time I opened the book, like, it had something that I wanted to get, and I have to get through this book to get that. And I kept reading. With American Gods, I didn't feel that. I found instead that every day I opened it up, I enjoyed what I read, but I felt like I could have stopped at any time. So I got to page 200 and I stopped. And I think that, that'll vary from book to book. So I could have chosen to read that book because I want to just say I read the complete book, and I could write a coherent review about it, and I could analyze what worked and didn't work. But I don't read like that. I feel like if there's not a sense that this book has something to give me, I won't read it. And that doesn't have to be a message. It's just an experience. There's something really cool going on. In the case of Leviathan Wakes, it's just the immersive, it's being pulled into that brilliantly envisioned world where Mars and Earth and the asteroid belt have become like the equivalent of Russia, U.S., and all the major world powers, and what they do with that. It's that the intrigue itself pulled me through, and I didn't come out of there with a different view about how the world works. I was kind of transformed. My imagination went somewhere that was really neat and changed a little bit how I think about the world, and that to me is good enough.
And it's also reader perception, because I read the same book. I didn't get the sort of U.S., Russia, other world powers feel to it. I just kind of read along for the intrigue aspect, because there's this, Well, I don't want to say too much, but there's certain events that happen that are really weird, and that was what pulled me along, and I totally missed everything that John just said.
That's actually a really cool point. And we are like almost at time. So I did have one kind of final thought that you reminded me of vis-a-vis like quality of writing or reading the same story at the same time. And I have a guilty pleasure. I love reading Dan Brown. You can make fun of me if you want.
I've read some of his stuff.
I want to read his stuff. I haven't read his stuff yet, but I will.
He just kind of tells the same story, especially the Robert Langdon novels. He just tells the same story over and over again. Like a hot young scientist or doctor or French woman is scared and the world needs his help, and some piece of art is the clue. And he deciphers it using his brilliant linguistic mind, and then some nefarious guy is stopped in his nefarious deeds. And it is the same story every time with different puzzles. And the writing I don't think is very strong. I've never thought of Dan Brown as a particularly strong writer. He's certainly knows how to write bestsellers, though, because it's just a compelling story to read. It's fun. And that's that notion of familiarity. That is me being like, yeah, I know what's going to happen here. I'm going to open this book. There's going to be some weirdo, either tattooed or an albino guy or whatever it is, and he's going to do something weird, and I'm going to be hooked. Let's do it. So, and I think that's totally okay. It's actually a lot of fun. Not every reading experience has to be world-shattering. In fact, I don't think they should. I think that reading can be fun.
Yeah.
So do you guys have any final thoughts before we let John give his homework to our listeners?
I just want to kind of build on something you just said. Not every read has to be world-shattering. My experience has been books that are meant to be world-shattering come off as kind of bland and uninteresting. And it's the ones that are written purely for entertainment, but they do something super creative with it that ends up being world-shattering for me. So like the Orphans Legacy series by Robert Buechner, it's like a standard military sci-fi stuff. But the fifth book just absolutely blew my mind. And it was world-shattering. Like I was dazed for about half a week or so after finishing that. And I mean, it was really good, but it wasn't meant to be world-shattering. Whereas when I read something that's meant to have that power, it comes off as kind of half-hearted.
Yeah,
I think that's good. I don't really have anything to add. So why don't I just give my exercise here?
Yes.
So this is actually taken from another great writing craft book that I would recommend to any writer. It's called The Art of Character by David Corbett. And so this is kind of based on that. He talks about how to find great characters and how to sort of connect to that, having a great character cast and probe the depths of them. And one of the topics in there is originality of your story idea. So what I'd like you to do for this exercise is think about movies, because we might have read a lot of books, but we've definitely all seen more movies than we've read books, I'm sure. So try to brainstorm a list of all the movies you could remember seeing. And then for each of those movies, try to write down what it was that you really liked about those movies. Like it could be a certain element or something that caused you to have a certain reaction. Within that list, now try to organize and look for patterns. See, in particular, the ones that made you cry or feel angry, feel amazed or stirred. These sort, and what was it specifically that caused that reaction? So the idea being, by putting that on the list and organizing it, you might start noticing some patterns and elements of stories that really resonate with you. And now finally think about the stories that you either have written or that you would like to write. And look at that list from the movies, and are some of those things in your stories? And if not, how could those things get worked into your stories? And this is a good exercise just to help you put stuff that really means something to you as a writer into what you're writing, which is the most important part, I think.
All right, you heard the man. With that, we're going to close out the episode. Thank you so much, and we will be back next week.